Hi, I'm Birgit O'Connor and welcome to my garden. Today I'd like to show you how I paint roses. I'll be working on a sheet of 22 by 30 cold press paper. Today I'd like to first of all start off with a demonstration of just a small section of the rose. It'll be more of an abstracted shape that'll help you to understand how to create depth and drama before I go ahead and apply it to an entire painting. So then when we work on the painting, I've chosen a Sally Holmes rose. That's a single petaled rose, and I'll show you how to create buds, leaves, and then perhaps maybe we might even work on some other roses. So let's go into the studio and let's get started. After I've been in my garden and then come into the studio to start a painting, I always like to start with a light pencil sketch on either 140 or 300 pound cold or rough press arches paper. Here you can see the reference material that I'll be using for this demonstration. So what I'm looking for when I'm looking at my reference photo is shape, shadow, and just the general feeling of it. I don't need every accurate detail. I'm just trying to capture the design, the overall appearance, and I want to simplify. I'm looking for the shadows and the basic shape, and where my medium values are that will help me roll the petals over. So what I'm looking for is simplicity. You can say so much more with less than overstating every detail. Otherwise, you're telling the whole story, and you're not allowing the viewer to use their own imagination. Before I start working on the actual painting, I'd first like to show you some techniques on how to create shape and shadow. I'll be working on a quarter sheet of Arches 140 pound cold press paper. And before I begin, I want to clean off my palette. I'll use a little spray bottle and just wipe off the inside of my palette. You can see how the wells aren't filled up with paint. I know some artists like to do that, and it works really well for them. But I always like to just add fresh paint to the colors I already have when I start a new painting. So the two colors I'm going to use for this demonstration are a little burnt umber and French ultramarine blue. With the French ultramarine blue and burnt umber or burnt sienna, those are some of my most favorite and consistent colors that I use throughout all my paintings. So to begin, I'm going to fill in this petal area with clean water with my large Cosmo Top brush. Any mop brush will do. You just want to have enough water so your color will be able to move. And I don't have to paint all the way up to the pencil line. I just need to be close to it. I'll be using a number 20 Winsor & Newton Scepter Gold Series round brush, take some color from my palette, and then go along the dry edge and allow the pigment to flow into the clean water. You can see how I don't have to fill the entire petal with color. What I'm focusing on is the shading that will help to give me some shape. By adding a simple stroke of color like this, it'll help to give the illusion of the petal rolling over. To smooth out my brush strokes, I just have to take a clean brush and gently go along the edges to help pull more of that color out. For any unwanted fuzzy lines, I can take my brush and gently scrub along the edge. Then I'll lift my paper up and help roll the pigment around. The clean water helps the color to move and smooth out the transitions. You can see how the blue is separating from the brown and creating its own natural value change. Some artists don't like to see the pigment settling in their washes, but I think it adds to the painting and makes it interesting. And then I'll let that dry before I go on to the next petal. I'll again fill this petal with clean water going almost right up to the edge, but not all the way. I'm going to get off the excess water on my towel. And now I'm only going to do a couple strokes to create shape. You can see I don't need to fill the entire petal to create some shape. It doesn't look like much now. You have to work the overall piece. And notice how I'm constantly turning my paper as I'm working. To help pull that color out, I'm going to use a clean brush filled with water and allow the color to blend into the petal. If I need to, I can add more color, then lift my paper and rotate it. That's what's going to give me those smooth transitions. It's easier for me to show you on a flower with just two colors, so you get the real basic idea of how to create this. You can see I'm constantly wiping off the excess water here. Then I'll let that petal dry. I'm going to use the same process by filling in this area with clean water, going almost right up to the edge of the pencil line. And I want to make sure that my application is pretty even so the color will be able to move. Then I'll use the same color combination and go just under the lip of this petal and bring it down so it starts to give the appearance of going underneath the next one. Remember, by having enough water in this area, it's going to help the color to be able to move easier. And if I need to smooth it out, I can use my clean brush and then roll that around again. And then let that dry. With the bottom petal, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm not going to be too concerned about really creating detail here. I just want to give you the idea of how to roll something over and how by just minimizing your brush strokes you can really create quite an illusion. Then I'll let that dry. Now you can see it's all pretty flat, and it has a little color here and there, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense because it doesn't have any depth. So now I have to add one of the most important parts. I'm going to create some shadows. I'm going to take my brush full of water and just go along the edge of the petals. Then I'll use the same color combination of French ultramarine blue and burnt umber in a darker value, meaning less water, and go along my petals. And I'm actually trying to get more of a nice dry line. I don't want this fuzzy line. Then I'm going to bring my brush stroke up along the edge of the wet and dry area. And by already having that water down, it makes it easier for me to pull up that pigment. And as I get a little closer to the top, I want to start integrating a lighter value, meaning only adding clean water. And for any excess water I might have, I can easily lift that out with the tip of my brush. For the smaller shadow area, I'll be using the same color combination in a medium value. You can see by applying it to dry paper, I have more control over my application. Then I'll let that dry. Notice by having the simple value changes in the shadows, it's already starting to help lift these petals. It helps to create some depth in these simple shapes. Now I'm going to let this layer dry. Notice how it's all starting to pull together. And for the finer details, I'll be using the same process, only in smaller areas. So now you can see how this petal is starting to lift from the background. You can see by having all the different value variations, it really helps to create depth. And to help bring it another step forward, I'm going to work on the background. If I was working on an entire painting, I could add stems and leaves, variegated colors, or maybe even other flowers. But for this purpose, I'm again going to simplify. I'll use the color combination of French ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and perhaps even a little indigo. You can see how I have to move quickly to prevent any drying lines. So they should help you have a better idea of how to create depth and shape without having to process what a flower is supposed to look like. Now I'll let this dry. This technique works beautifully if you want to work on white flowers. And we'll see what happens with my rosebud. Who knows, maybe it will turn out to be a white flower. But I'll decide that as I go along. So hopefully this is giving you a better idea of how to create shape and shadow and some depth. So now let's apply this to an entire painting. So to begin with, I'm again going to mix my color mixture. I'm going to use the French ultramarine blue and the burnt umber. Then I'm going to repeat exactly what I did on that small demonstration. I'm going to fill in the petal area with water, mix my color combination on my palette, then apply the brush strokes just under the rim of these petals so I can start to work on my shading. I'm not too happy with the shape of this petal, so I'm just going to use my imagination. Since I have a lot of water on my petal, I can be free with my brush strokes. Now if I was working on a red flower, I wouldn't start with these blues. I would actually start with more of a dark red color for the shading. Using the French ultramarine blue and the burnt umber is really the easiest way to give you the best idea of how to apply the shading. Now remember, I'm going to lift the paper up to help the color move. If I left it flat, the color would dry just as you see it here. And then to help give it a roll, I'm going to add this stroke of color. And to help smooth it out, I'm going to use clean water on my brush and help it move. Now if I want to, at this point while it's still damp, I can reapply more color. And I'll have to work quickly, otherwise I can create backwashes. And notice how much lighter this petal dries. Now I can start thinking about working on the next one. If the previous petal wasn't completely dry, when I'm applying the clean water, I could easily have little run marks going back into the pigment. I'm again going to fill in this area with clean water almost right up to the pencil line. Then I'll take my blue-gray combination and go right along the edge. Notice how I'm holding my hand closer to the tip of the brush because I want to have more control over where I place my color. And how I'll move my hand back when I want more freedom. Now I can always look at my reference photo, but I'm not trying to match that. I just want to get the general feeling of the shading and the values. You can see how my color really isn't smooth. So again, I'm just going to take my clean brush and start to smooth that out. Then I'll lift my paper up and roll it around. so I can soften up the color and even it out. So you can really see how I'm working my way around the painting one petal at a time. Now I'll go down to this next petal. Using the same applications, notice how I'm using my brush strokes to create ridges here. And this white area in between will actually end up looking like the highlight to help roll this petal over. Now once these two petals are dry, I can then go on to the next areas. I want to make sure that they're completely dry first, and to do that, touch it with the back of your hand. If you want a nice hard line, you need to make sure that your paper's really dry. Or if you want a soft look, it's alright that your surface is damp. The disadvantage with that is that you may end up with some unwanted blossoms or feathery effects. To help me have a better idea of where I place my shading, I can always refer back to my reference photo. Remember, I don't want to match it exactly. It's only to help give me an idea. This way I'm giving myself the freedom to explore, and more of how I'm feeling will actually come out. Then I'll move my paper around and blend the colors and allow it to dry. I can direct the way the paint flows by the movement of the paper. Now if you have problems with your paper buckling, if you work one area at a time, it will usually minimize that. And if buckling still occurs, you can wait for your painting to entirely dry, turn it over, then spray the back with clean water, place it on a clean surface, and then place weight on the back. If you want to, you can even iron it. Again, place it face down, spray the back, and iron it on a medium heat. You can see how I'm working my way around my painting. My intention is to build the shading of the entire flower before I start working on more color and details. And I'll continue to rotate my paper to help me find the balance and where I might need to add more color. For any areas that look like they're having just a little too much water, I'll again use the tip of my brush to help lift it out. And then I'm going to keep moving it until I'm satisfied with the way it lays, and then I'm going to let that dry. Let me show you the difference about applying the paint directly to the paper compared to the clean water. I'm going to apply some water to my paper. Notice how this can have a soft appearance. And if I take my brush and go up to the edge where the water meets the dry paper, you can see how I can have a nice hard line. I can also apply the brush stroke directly to dry paper, but if I don't have enough water and color, I could actually catch the tooth of the surface. That can be wonderful for textured effects, but you have to know when to use it. Another technique for softening an edge is placing your brush stroke onto dry paper and then using a clean brush to soften one side out. As I start to get closer to the center of my flower, I'm going to start to reduce the size of my brush. This will help me to have more control over where I place my pigment. Remember, this is what I would call my first layer. I'm just getting the overall feel for the painting, then I'm going to reevaluate. Notice how I'm just minimizing the color that I'm putting in, because I'm not trying to completely work every petal at this time. For the center, I'm going to add just a spot of color and blend it out. So now I have to decide, do I want to add some color to this, or do I want this only to be a white rose? It might make it a little more interesting to add some color. So I'm going to test some colors and see what I like. I'll take my test strips. In fact, I've made my blue color here, and I'll wipe off my palette. I'm thinking what would look nice with the blue is maybe a little Naples yellow. I'm just going to go ahead and try a little bit on my palette here and put it on there. Maybe a little quinacridone gold. That might make it interesting. Then I could always turn it into a green flower and mix it. I'm trying a little yellow ochre. I think, what do I want to do with this? Since I showed you the basic technique of how to create a rose, I'd like to make it more interesting. So what I think I'm going to do is use a little Naples yellow. So let's experiment. I'm going to reapply some water to certain areas just so I can get a feel for it. I'm not sure how this is going to look, but I always just plunge in. This is where you can allow yourself just to have some fun. Try not to be too analytical. Allow your body and your emotions to fill in the flower with color. I'm going to mix the quinacridone magenta with the Naples yellow so I have a nice blush color. Then I'll go along the inside edge of the center of the flower to help give it the appearance of rolling under the next petal. You can already see how the color is starting to change the appearance of the flower. I decided I wanted to variegate more of the color, so I'm going to add more quinacridone magenta to the Naples yellow. And since my surface is still wet, the colors can blend easily into each other. Actually, I like how this is turning out, but how would I have known that if I didn't experiment? Here you can see how by adding the additional color, it starts to help add more depth. Just got some color on my hand. I just got some blue on my hand and I want to make sure that I get off any extra pigment, otherwise I'm going to end up with color throughout my entire painting and all sorts of areas I don't want. Like I just got a little bit there. And so what I have to do is re-wet it quickly and then wipe it up until I'm satisfied with the results. Make sure I don't have any more in my hand. Notice how I didn't try to get all the color down the first time around. I wanted to reevaluate and see what I liked. By laying the lighter yellow on top of the blue, that's called glazing. In this application, it has a nice blended appearance. It also helps to tone down the blues. Now if you look at the demonstration, this is also called glazing, and it has more of a severe look because I didn't try to blend it in. I just laid one color on top of the other. So I'm just going to continue working my way around my flower. I'll continue to re-wet the areas that I want to work on. Then I'm going to go and cut in. One reason why I'm laying the lighter color on top of the dark is because I changed my mind and I decided I didn't want to have a white flower. I wanted to make it more interesting. I could use a larger brush to apply my color, but this way I have more control. Since I have enough water, I can even scrub some color on. But be careful not to overdo it, otherwise you can lift the previous layer. This is backwashing a little bit because I wasn't paying attention to it, so I can just lift this out with a towel. Here's a really good example. You can see how using the same color really helps to give this area shape and depth. Now I can refer back to my reference photo and see how I'm doing with my color application. What I'm now looking for are where are the areas that I want to push back and pull forward. That's all going to be handled with value and color intensity. So as I'm getting closer to the center, I'm no longer thinking of this as a bud. I'm thinking of it only as abstracted shapes and balance. When I'm working on the smaller areas, I like to use either a number 6 or number 8 round synthetic brush. Since it's not a natural hair or fiber, it's not going to hold ample amounts of water. If I was only thinking of this as a bud, I could absolutely get stuck in my linear mind, instead of allowing my intuition to guide me. The best way to recognize that is to notice your body, and if you're holding your breath or you're feeling tense, let it go and relax. Remember, these colors that I'm adding are a quinacridone magenta, a Naples yellow, and a quinacridone gold over the French ultramarine blue and burnt umber. Working the details can be a little tedious and time-consuming, but this is what's going to help give the illusion between complexity and simplicity. Now I'm going to reevaluate and decide where I want to go next. Do I want to work on my shadows or my background first? If I work on my background, I'll be able to have a better idea of the overall balance. And that will help me to have a better idea of how dark I want to go with my shadows. I'm going to use a color combination of French ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and a little indigo. It's going to help build a really dark value, and that will in turn help really push out those lighter petals. Notice how I'm applying this to dry paper and not to a wash, because I want a richer saturation of color. You can also see how I'm getting this really crisp line because the petal is completely dry and then this background color is coming up to the dry paper. As a reminder, if you're a right-handed painter, try to keep your palette on your right-hand side. That way you're not dragging color across your painting and possibly ruining it. For the background, I might even consider variegating the color to help make it a little more interesting. I might add a little brown or green. Use your intuition and see what you like. I might even only add water to help change the values. And again, if it's puddling, I can use the tip of my brush to help lift out the excess water. I can also lift my paper and help roll it around so the extra water can blend out to the edge. You want to make sure if you have a puddle on this side that you're not dragging it across like that. If I tilt it on this way to move this color, that could have a tendency to scream across my painting. So I'll want to lift out any excess water. Then I'm going to wipe up the excess water on my table and let that dry. So now I'm looking at the overall view of the painting, and where do I want to add some more color to help give it more shape and body. At this point I could actually stop and start working on my shadows. You can see how it's very nice and light and decorative, and I don't have to go so bold. But I can't do that. My tendency is to plunge in and push it. So I'm pretty happy here with the general appearance of the flower. And again, if I wanted to, I could actually stop and start working on my shadows. But I want this flower to be full and rich, so I'm going to work a little more on building my depth. So some of the colors I'm going to be choosing again are French ultramarine blue, a little quinacridone gold, a little yellow ochre, and mix those together. And I think I'll even add a little quinacridone magenta. Now to help bring this bud a little more out, I'm going to use my same application of wetting the inside of the petal area, then applying my color. You might be thinking that this is a pretty bold approach, especially when it was so nice and light and delicate. My intention is not to change that, only to create more depth. Remember, I can always use my clean brush to help smooth and blend any of the uneven pigment. This color by itself doesn't really seem to make sense. It stands out. That's why, again, I need to work the overall painting. Now when applying your pigment, remember that you have to move fairly quickly. Otherwise, you can be left with unwanted brushstroke marks. I know this application of color can seem a little uncomfortable and daring, but again, experiment. This is actually going to be pretty forgiving because I'm really working on only applying shading. So if you were working on a flower and you plunged into the center like this, you might think that you've ruined your painting. But again, continue on and work the overall piece. Now you can see how much softer it appears when dry, and right now it seems to look separate from the rest of the painting, but I'm easily going to be able to incorporate this. Now that I've worked on the inside of the flower, I'm going to go to the back petal to balance it out. You might be thinking that this color is just way too dark, but remember, watercolor always dries lighter. And then I'm going to reapply some Naples and Hansa yellow along with the quinacridone magenta to help build more color. For the inside of the flower, I'll use the same color combination along with a little French ultramarine blue to help give it more depth. For the outside petal, I'm going to increase the quinacridone magenta and the Naples yellow to help give it more of a warm appearance and shape. And then for the finer details, I'll use the same color combination, only in smaller areas. To help me with that application, I can use either a number 6 or number 8 round brush. To help me hold the color intensity that I want, I'm going to apply the paint directly to dry paper instead of a wash. When I'm happy with my application, I'll take my clean brush and help smooth out the edges. Now I can finally start working on my shadows. I'll use the color combination of French ultramarine blue and burnt umber and apply it directly to dry paper. I want my value to be pretty dark because that's what's going to help me have more depth. As I move to the outside of my petal, I'm going to incorporate more water into my shadow so it has a variation of color and it won't appear flat. Now for this next almost hidden shadow, I want it to be more of a middle range value. This way, it's going to really help make the painting more interesting and show more variations. Remember to keep rotating your paper. That way you'll continue to see the visual balance of your painting. This is another advantage I have by not being attached to a board. I'm going to rework some of these areas, and notice how I'm being selective of where I'm applying my color, because I want these petals to look like they're coming out from the inside. Here I want to use a combination of hard and soft edges because it's going to help give the painting a lot more interest. I like to variegate my brush strokes, going from wide to thin, and I have to move quickly, otherwise I can have permanent unwanted marks. Another advantage to rotating your paper is that it helps you with the application of your color. This shadow might be a little too heavy and too hard, so I'm just going to lift out some of this color. And maybe add more water to it and allow it to dry. To help me see if maybe this painting's complete, I'm going to place a mat over it, because if you have a mat, it's going to change everything. If you're only looking at the piece by itself, you might also have a tendency to overwork it. You can see by adding your mat, It helps to get rid of all the external distraction. And now you're able to have a better idea of how all the darks and lights play off each other. Now those bold applications of color don't appear to be as intense. And remember to work your overall painting and not to focus on only one area. Otherwise, you can easily overwork it. Now we'll work on stems and leaves. My intention is not to create an entire painting with this. It's just simply to show you how to create some shape for the stems. So, I'm just going to do something really simple here. It's not going to look like much, but then I'll fill in this area with clean water. Remember that my controlled lines come from the edge of where I place my water, and the blending effects are inside that area. I'm going to get a little permanent sap green, a little yellow ochre, and maybe a little French ultramarine blue. Then I'll take my color and go along the inside edge of the stem and allow the color to blend out into the center. This may not really look like much, but if I want to, I can variegate the color, and that'll help make it look a little more natural. Remember, to help blend your colors, lift your paper up and move it around. And see this center line? This is going to be my highlighted area. And if I have too much water on my stem, I can use my clean brush and lift it out. You can see how this is already starting to get some shape. Let's say I wanted to make some thorns. I have a couple of options. I can create two lines and fill them in, or I can simply manipulate my brush stroke. I know that this stem is much larger than the one that you would use for a painting, but it really helps to give you a good idea of how to create it. If I wanted to make smaller stems, I would use the same application process and reduce the size of my brushes. And notice how important my darker color is to create shape. I'll continue to add more pigment until I'm satisfied with the results. And here, working on white paper, you can really see the difference of the hard edge and the soft blending. If I need to, I can always use a clean brush to help lift out any excess pigment to help preserve this highlight. And now for the fun part, adding the thorns. You can actually move fairly quickly because I'm using the wet into wet application and allowing the colors to blend, which will help to give it a more natural look. And that's how I would make my basic rose stems. Now to work on the leaves. I'll again be using Arch's 140-pound cold press paper. And then I want to come up with a very simple design so you can understand how to create a basic leaf. Roses can have little bunches of leaves that break off from the main stem. They're usually in the number of around 3 to 5. I'm going to use the same application of water and color as I did throughout the entire painting and on the stems. And if you've ever noticed rose leaves, you'll see that they almost have a thorny appearance too. So again, I'll use the tip of my brush to help pull out a few edges. You can see here how easily the color moves inside the water of this leaf. By adding these little details along the edge, it really helps to make this an unusual shape. You can see I don't need to fill the entire area with color. I'm going to use the whites to my advantage and help give the illusion of the sun reflecting off the surface. Now if I was working on a different flower with different leaves, I would use basically the same application process, only in a different shape. If I wanted a richer saturation of color, I would wait for this to completely dry and then reapply. Then for these really small stems, I'm just going to loosely brush in a stroke of color so the leaves are actually connected. When choosing colors for your greens, you may even want to just consider using a combination of your yellows and your blues. And there I have some rose leaves. Well, thanks for joining me today, and I hope that you've enjoyed yourself. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact me at birgitoconnor.com, and I look forward to seeing you next time.